Your homework is to basically study. Study for the quiz tomorrow and then study for the test. You'll notice there are 3 essays available for you online. You're only going to be writing one of them on the test, but we don't know which one's getting dropped, so prepare for 2. Understand? Any questions on any of that? OBKBs. So, we are looking at 2 different sections. First, Africa and its interactions with Europe in this period. And secondly, new economic thought. How many of you guys have had studies in economics so far? Have you guys studied economics at all? Okay, that's fine. I just need to know where to start from when we talk about these things. So let's start with the basics. That's not a problem. But first, we're going to talk about Africa. And note, we're going to kind of look at this through the lens of European interaction, because to be perfectly honest, if we wanted to go into depth about Africa, we could spend an entire semester talking about Africa. Africa was not just this giant unknown place, although that's pretty much how Europeans saw it. They saw it as a bunch of stuff on the outside and then scary darkness on the inside. They literally called it the Dark Continent. It was unknown, it was dangerous. For all they knew, there were dragons hanging out there. And there were very powerful kingdoms there that could pretty easily crush the Europeans. That might seem weird, because we hear about, European domination of Africa, and enslavement, and conquest, and colonization. That's going to come later. At this point in time, Europe does not have the power to even think about that. So they more or less have a working relationship with the various empires within Africa. So, as we look at the beginnings of the transatlantic slave trade, understand something. This is one of the major effects of the Columbian Exchange, and it's going to impact both Africa and Europe for centuries. It's a really big deal. So let's start with that all-inclusive concept of the Columbian Exchange. What is it by definition? Well, it's the exchange of people, ideas, and goods between the old world and new world. And that indeed is a concept we have to really kind of think of, the new world versus the old world. Think about the impact it would be if we colonized Mars. What kind of relationship will we have with our Martian brothers? It's a literal new world, isn't it? Full of all kinds of exciting possibilities. Now, to be frank, Mars is pretty much a giant desert at this point. So it's, going to be kind of interesting to see how we can make, living in this giant desert possible. But there's all kinds of interesting ideas that this might change society. We might have a development of a new civilization that's totally foreign to ours. New types of government. I mean, it's a literal new world. Might start bringing back new types of things to experience. Not so much on a life standpoint, but minerals, all kinds of stuff. I mean, stuff we don't even know. We've never been there, except sitting groves. So it's an interesting idea, nonetheless. But this is essentially what the new world was. It's literally a new world for people to explore. The world is doubles. And explorations involve going to all these new places, finding new things, new foods that have never been experienced before. And we are also going to bring goods that folks in the new world have never experienced before. This exchange of goods is going to have a major impact in a lot of different ways. The sugar trade is going to be a major reason for the enslavement of Africans and the forced migration of millions of people over time. There's going to be the effect of cultural change because of this. The European population skyrockets because of new crops, new things available to them. There are tremendous effects due to the Columbian Exchange. And this is the thing to understand. What does Columbus contribute? It's not just discovering something. It's not just discovery. Because people will trash that and say, well, he didn't really discover those Vikings. That's irrelevant. The Viking discovery of North America did not change the world the way the Columbian Exchange does. That's Columbus's legacy as much as anything. I'm going to show you a picture real quick to kind of give the idea of some of the things that we're talking about here. Stuff coming from the Americas to Europe. Peppers, tobacco, pineapples, cacao, chocolate, beans, vanilla, corn, tomatoes, potatoes, peanuts, turkeys, pumpkins, and squash. What comes the other way? Onions, olives, turnips, coffee beans, peaches, a variety of different grains, livestock, and look at this. Oh, sweet mambly jamblies. Look at all them diseases. Entire groups of people cease to exist. Honeybees, sugarcane, bananas, grapes, citrus trees, all these things coming back, and not to mention the movement of peoples. What happens is, sugar, as we pointed out, is really, really expensive in Europe. And so if you can grow sugar, you can make a killing. You can make a ton of money. And it just so happens that sugar is only going to grow along the tropics. This area in the Caribbean and also in South America, right in the tropics. So it's great for growing sugar. But the thing is, making sugar is really labor intensive. You got to grow the plants, you got to chop it up, you got to refine it. There's a lot that goes into actually making sugar. So this is going to require a massive amount of labor. And so first, the natives are enslaved. You use Native American laborers. They start dying en masse because of these, this laundry list of diseases that we brought with us. And so we turn to other places in the tropics to force labor. And this brings to effect the transatlantic slave trade. Now, as I was talking about Africa, I pointed out that the Europeans aren't going into the interior. In fact, Europeans abducting tribesmen would actually possibly facilitate a war. So the idea of slavers, you might have in your head as a bunch of white dudes creeping through the jungle and stealing people, but that's really not how it went down. Slavery in Africa is much more complicated than that. To understand African slavery, first I have to understand African war. War in Africa, for much of its history, wasn't really that bloody compared to European wars. It was really more about psychological warfare and presence and aggression. People still died for sure, but it was in numbers way smaller than we see going on in European armies, where you have literally lines of battle hammer at each other and people die in the thousands. So this is a lot rarer than that. And so for the most part, what it was all about was gaining territory and gaining slaves. Essentially, if you captured someone in battle and you spared their life, they owed their life to you and became a slave. So then you could do with them what you want. You could trade them, you could get goods with them, all kinds of different stuff. And so what happened is the Europeans, seeing this, decided, well, we want to buy slaves from you. But the Europeans restricted what they could trade for slaves. The only thing they would trade for slaves was guns. Or rather, look at it the other way direction. The Africans wanted to buy guns from Europeans, and the only thing that they would accept in exchange for a gun is a slave. Now, that was by design. Guns provide a tremendous advantage in battle. And so what would happen is these African tribesmen would buy guns so that they could go to war to get more guns. The purpose for that is pretty quickly, if you didn't have any guns, you were going to get destroyed by your enemy. So you had to get guns of your own to defend yourself. And ideally, you have more guns than your enemies. So what happened is this European movement of guns into Africa actually stimulated the numbers of wars. So basically, the amount of wars happening in Europe skyrocketed. I mean, not in Europe, in Africa. They kind of ramped it up because there's this endless cycle of we need more guns, so we've got to go to war to get more guns so we can fight the next war, and so on and so forth. So what's kind of weird is, if you were to ask the average African leader or noble, hey, do you like slavery? Do you want to stop this? They'd be like, no, we can't stop it. We need this slave trade going on so we can get more guns. That's not to say everybody was all for it. Futa Toro was one kingdom ideally situated right about here, that was pretty much in the way of the slave traders going to the ports to work with the Europeans. And so the Alwini, the kind of king of Futa Toro, banned any slave traders from going through his land. So he was effectively trying to stop the slave trade, and the Europeans tried to bribe him. They're saying, hey, let's give you some money, let's make this happen. Even his own nobles were like, come on, let this happen, let's do this. And he was like, absolutely not. And so eventually the Europeans tried to get his own nobles, his own leaders to revolt against him, but he had too much power, they couldn't do that either. So eventually the Europeans just kind of shrugged and went around Futa Toro. And so for a small period of time, this kind of stymied the flow of slaves a little bit, but it didn't have the effect that was necessary. And as we're going to see, this is going to dramatically impact Europe, or Africa. Impacting Europe as well, but Africa especially. There's going to be a tremendous effect on their economy. There's going to be a tremendous effect on its population. Because the folks who Europeans are buying are having specific traits that are desirable for slaves. What traits physically would be desirable in a slave, do you think? Who are they looking for? Strong, good. What else? Do you want sick or healthy? Think about it, healthy, of course. Have you guys ever seen, what's the movie? Kunta Kinte. I'm talking about? I'll think of it. Where they inspect people's teeth to make sure they have good teeth and good health. Young or old?
Yeah.
Smart or dumb? Smart. The reason for that, you might think dumb because then they would obey, but trust me, it's not hard to get someone to obey you. There's all kinds of terrible things they can do to people to make them obey. You want a smart slave, though, because they can do more tasks, yes? So essentially, we're trying to enslave the smartest, the healthiest, the youngest, the best of this people. We're going to do it for 300 years. You can see the effects this might be happening now. So, all these things contribute to the effects that the slave trade has on Africa. Now, let's talk about the Midwest Passage itself. Slaves on a ship. This is a pretty infamous photo or image depicting the stacking of slaves within the hull of the slave ship. You can see how they're all packed in, yeah? Here's the thing is, this doesn't give the whole picture because this is from the top down. If you were to actually be in the slave holds, this is what you'd see. Now keep in mind, how long does it take to get across the Atlantic? It's over a month. If memory serves, it's like a month and a half, something like that. You're let out 1 hour per day. If someone's seasick, has a bathroom accident, there's not enough water or food going around, disease is common, people die, you might be chained to a corpse for 2 days before someone notices. Because the thing is, that whole letting them out 1 hour every day, sometimes they forgot. This is what happens when you treat people as things. That's what slavery is. It's the ownership of another person. And whenever you minimize someone, you take apart who they are and just make them a thing, this is what happens. Because what they're trying to do is get as many people across the sea as possible, as efficiently as possible. It's the same way you might think about stacking lumber. Just efficiency. Get them in, and there we go. We're ready to go. If some of them die, it happens. It's hard for us to imagine, I think, the treatment of people like this because of where we live. But keep in mind, this still goes on. You guys know what I'm talking about? I'm sure you've studied it before, human trafficking. Not necessarily in wooden ships, but certainly packing folks into semi-trucks. Instances of smuggling people across the border. I mean, it's not a nice business, and it still is with us, and no matter how hard we try, it seems we can't get rid of this. So it's a sobering thought, if nothing else. And it's going to have a major impact, both in Europe and in Africa. How many of you guys have ever seen the movie La Amistad? You know the story of Amistad? Okay. Very good movie. However, some warnings about it. It is rated R, so parental guidance is heavily suggested because there's some scenes that are pretty harsh to see in this movie. The story is about, this actually takes place later in American history as well, but a group of slaves who were poached, illegally taken from Africa. Because towards the turn of the 1700s, a lot of European nations start banning slavery. Maybe we don't adopt it until the late 1700s, but suffice it to say there's this discussion of abolitionism going on. And ultimately, one of the main effects of this is slavery itself isn't made illegal, but the slave trade is made illegal. And so what happens is there's still a hungry desire for slavery, but you're limited on where you can import them from. And so what happens is poachers would go in and steal them from Africa and move them across the Atlantic to try to make a profit. The thing is, the U.S. Navy was blockading Africa, which is really a tall order. I mean, it's really almost impossible for them to do, but it was in that movie. And so what happens is the slave ship, basically, there's a slave revolt on board. And the slaves end up killing all the people on the slave ship and try to figure out how to sail it back to Africa. While that's going on, a U.S. naval ship silos up and says, you know, what's going on here? And they basically capture all the slaves and take them to America. And from that point, a legal battle breaks out between what to do with these slaves. One group, basically the slaves, are saying that they're from Africa, which would mean by law they should be returned to Africa and set free. However, the folks who owned the illegal slave ship come up and say, no, this is our ship. These folks killed all of our people. We want it back so we can recoup the losses. And when the American court kind of raised their eyebrows and say, they're saying they're from Africa, they're like, no, they're confused. They're from Jamaica. You know, you're not understanding it. Which technically Jamaica was a place they could buy slaves from. So they're basically saying, we're on the up and up, until they weren't. The third group in this lawsuit is the folks on board the Navy ship. You see, technically speaking, slaves are items. They're property. And so what happens when you find random floating property on the ocean? You get to claim salvage rights. You get to take the ship as your own and sell all the slaves and make a nice profit. So all the crew on that naval ship are saying, nah, we found them, they're ours now. We get to sell them, we get to make the money. And so this legal battle breaks up. It goes all the way to the Supreme Court, involving presidents and all this other shenanigans. And all the while, you see from the African standpoint, they don't speak English. They don't know what's going on. They know that they're trying to be determined where they're from and all this sort of stuff, and they're trying to communicate with the lawyers defending them. But otherwise, it's this really kind of clash of cultures, awe-inspiring sort of thing, as these men and women fight for their freedom. Really equality, I highly recommend it. But as I said, rated R for a very good reason. There are some really brutal, hard scenes to watch. For instance, there's one part where the slave masters on the ship, I forget if they have too many people on board, they run low on food, or I think they saw a ship on the distance and thought it was a U.S. Navy cutter. So basically, they got this line of chained slaves, tied an anchor to one end, threw it overboard, and drug them all down to the ocean depths to drown. So, pretty hard, but otherwise pretty quality. So, just throwing that out there. It is very much rated R, though. You very much need permission from parents to see because, as I said, it's pretty brutal, but also, I think, very worth it. You see exactly what the cost to humanity the slave trade really, really was. So now that we're done with all that uplifting stuff, let's turn to economics. Okay, by the way, that was section 3. We're done with that. So here's on to section 4. It's literally one slide. I've done a lot of heavy condensing here to make it easier to grasp. So let's talk economics. Okay. The first thing you need to know about economics is pretty much everything can be summarized by the interaction of two forces: supply and demand. Essentially, it goes like this. Supply is how much of something there is. Demand is how much people want that thing. These two forces interact in order to determine price. If all things are equal in terms of demand, the less of something there is, the more people are willing to pay for it. The more something there is, the less people are willing to pay for it. If that's one of the very important basics. Now let's talk businesses. There is an interaction that you have in the economy with businesses. Essentially, the more you buy of something, the better a business does, and so on and so forth. Where you get your money is from working at a business. And so, essentially, money flows from homes, which is you guys, into the market, into businesses, that is then paid back out to workers, and the cycle continues. Part 3. In order for businesses to be created, you have to have money. You have to have cash. Consider this. One of these days, you guys might want to start a business. If you decided that you have a great idea for the next great restaurant, you're gonna put Gordon Ramsay to shame. Where are you gonna get money for your restaurant? How are you gonna start it? How are you gonna get money for it? Well, that's one way. Traditionally, the way is you have that money to begin with, but assuming you don't, a loan's a great way to start. You can get a loan from a bank, maybe. However, banks don't generally like to give very much money for businesses. The reason for that is pretty simple. Most businesses that start off fail. And if you don't make enough money to cover any differences, they might not be able to take enough from your failed business to cover their collateral. So it's kind of a high-risk thing for them. And you have to understand risk as we look at economics. Risk is the potential for you to lose money. So, for instance, if you buy something on the plans of selling it later, if that value of that item goes down, by the time you sell it, you've lost money, and therefore you're out of money. That's one of the reasons why people say buying a new car is a bad investment. You're not going to make that money back if you turn around and sell it immediately. So, this is one of the things to consider is risk. Risk assessment. How much money you're willing to risk. If you start a business, you're risking a lot. Because if that business fails, any money you personally put into it is gone forever. So generally speaking, people want to avoid high risk unless it also comes with a high potential for reward. Which, again, going to business, if your business is really successful, then you're going to make a ton of money. So it's high risk, high reward, potentially. Does that make sense? You guys understand when I say risk versus reward? Okay. This is going to make all this other stuff make a lot more sense. So, another way that if you're starting a business, you can get people interested in it, you can get money, is by the selling of stock. A stock is part ownership of a company. Now, you don't actually get any benefits from that stock usually. Like, for instance, whenever you give someone money to buy stock in a company, you don't get any portion of that company's profits. What you do get is to hold on to that stock, and if the business does very well, there's going to be increased desire, increased demand for that stock, and so that means the price goes up. So you can then sell that stock later and make money on it. So for instance, if you buy a stock that is $500 per share of stock, and then you sell it when it's worth $800 per share, 500 less 800 is 300. You've made $300 for your investment. Does that make sense? I'm seeing a lot of folks with their heads on the desk, not paying attention, and not giving me a heads up, yes, no, maybe so. Does that make sense, yes or no? Okay, this is important. Because stock allows us to start businesses when we normally couldn't. This means more people can participate in the markets. More people can own businesses. I can start a business if I have enough stock interest, if I can sell enough stock, when normally I couldn't because I didn't have enough money. This also minimizes my personal risk. I can invest in not only my business, but I can invest in someone else's business, and if that business goes under, I'm not losing everything I have. I'm just losing whatever money I put in the stock. Does that make sense? This is important because more and more people can become wealthy off of these great voyages going to China and bringing back exotic spices and things like that, and they get shares of whatever it brings back called dividends. So the importance of joint stock companies, what we're talking about, is that more people can benefit from capitalism, investing money into businesses who normally couldn't, and also minimizes risk. That's going to stimulate the economy of Europe, the economies of Europe, I should say, tremendously over the next few years. Businesses are going to be spiraling up. More people are being wealthy off of it. This is the birth of the middle class. You can have people become wealthy off of trade as opposed to having to simply be born to money. In fact, this is going to create a lot of the tensions we see between the middle class and the noble class, which results in the beginnings of democracy as we know it today. So this is going to have tremendous impacts later on. Now, the economic mindset of the time in Europe was mercantilism. And basically they believed that a country's power was determined by its hard cash, on its gold it had in its coffers. Now that actually makes kind of a lot of sense. If you have a lot of money, you're more powerful than those who don't have a lot of money, yes? But here's the thing of it is the United States the most powerful nation in the world? Yes or no? I don't want to be wrong, so I'm not going to answer. No. Why not? Based upon what criteria, I suppose we'd say? Do we have the biggest military? Yeah, by a long shot. Do we have the biggest economy? No. Oh yeah. We crushed the next closest person is China, and we're like 3 times larger than their economy. So by what criteria would we not be the strongest? And from a mercantile standpoint, you'd be absolutely right. That's what they would say. But here's the thing: is debt isn't necessarily bad. There are things called good debts, things that can benefit you, such as investment opportunities. But you've got to be careful with those, again, because of the whole issue of risk. Now, when we talk about countries, however, who are they in debt to? Well, who are we in debt to, mostly? Ourselves. How is this possible? Because when we talk about debt, we have to understand that is a loan from the government. Governments get loans from different banks and things like that, but a lot of its debt, most of its debt, comes from the sales of government bonds. Essentially, it's sort of like a government IOU. You can cash it in later for more money. The idea is it's an investment, you know. It's not a really great investment, but it is an investment, and it's pretty secure because essentially the government almost never defaults on its bonds. So what happens is Americans who are trying to invest for the future, who might want retirement, things like that, they buy stocks, they buy bonds, they buy certificates of deposit, and they also buy government bonds. So we are mostly in debt to ourselves. Now, China does have a lot of our bonds as well. They bought a lot, so they do have a lot of debt. But that's actually not really as much a concern as some people might believe. Like some people are like, oh my gosh, they're going to crash our economy, they'll cash all those bonds at once. That would be a terrible idea. Because you know who buys most of Chinese goods? Americans. So if they crash their economy, who's going to buy their things? They crash their own economy if they do that. That's the thing about international economics, we're all tied together. So we don't want to do that. So that's kind of the flaws of mercantilism. They'd say, well, if you're in debt, you're weak, but that's clearly not true. But it also kind of makes sense from a certain standpoint. Another thing the mercantilists believed was that you had to have either a surplus of trade or a balance of trade. What that means is a surplus is you export more than you import. In other words, you sell more than you buy. Or at very least, you should buy as much as you sell. It should be balanced. A deficit is the opposite. It's where you buy more than you sell. Do you guys know what we have in the U.S.? Are we at a deficit or a surplus in terms of trade? It's probably exactly what you're thinking. We have a deficit by a huge amount. We have a huge deficit. Does it matter? Not so much. Because we also sell a lot of stuff to ourselves. We're kind of sort of interdependent as well as interdependent. So that's not necessarily a bad thing either. So the point of this is, mercantilism isn't really true, but it is going to provide a measure of understanding how economics works in terms of major markets, and it's going to push nations to essentially try to control these trade routes. It's going to drive them to war in some cases. And so it's very kind of predatory, and it's sort of like an early viewpoint of economics, but nevertheless, it does actually benefit some nations pretty heavily. France actually emerges as a leading power at this time, and their economy is booming during this era. But suffice it to say, these are some kind of important concepts, especially when we talk about the joint stock companies and why that's going to matter later on. Because without that, we don't have a middle class. Without the strong middle class, we don't have challenges to noble power, which result in countries like the United States of America being powerful. And we don't really have this understanding, this big push for independence. So it's going to have a major effect. And not just the U.S. money, all over the world. All of these different nations and all these different colonies and things like that, creating the nations of the world today. Any questions on this? Okay. Be ready for a quiz on this tomorrow. Tomorrow, we review. The next day, we review. Thursday, test. You got it? Get it? Good. That's it. Yeah. Nope, just study. All week, just study. Study, study, study. Study. Yep.